Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Ana Principi, and I am the Undersecretary of Institutional Relations and International Cooperation at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences at the National University of La Plata. I would like to welcome you all to this, the fifth cycle of conferences we are holding as part of this new joint project between the USA and Argentina, Shared Dialogues on Gender, Ethnicity, Geopolitics, History, and Memory. The project is one of the beneficiaries of the U.S. Embassy in Argentina's grant program for cooperation and exchange projects. The University of La Plata is extremely grateful to the Embassy for choosing and sponsoring this series of conferences. I particularly like to thank the cultural assistant of the U.S. Embassy in Argentina, Dr. Michael McLean, and the specialists Norris Cerdá and Giselle Dubinsky for all their support and hard work during the preparation process. I would like to thank as well Gabriel Merino, Amanda Barrenengoa, Fernando Rigone, and Ignacio Angelani for all their support and hard work too. At these events, 22 professors from the USA and Argentina have discussed and will discuss and call into questions the connections, intersections, and points of contact between concepts such as ethnicity, class, geopolitics, history, and memory. This speaks of academic bonds, both previous and reinforced by the project, academic bonds and dialogues. This is in part the richness of these seminars. But apart from these bonds between scholars and institutions, I have no doubts that the lectures will also encourage the audience to ask questions and engage in new discussions. At today's sessions, we'll hear from Dr. Beverly Silver, and before that, Amanda Barrenengoa will introduce her. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. So good afternoon, everybody. We want to thank Professor Beverly Silver for joining us today, and I will present her. Beverly Silver is a professor in the Department of Sociology and a director of the Arrighi Center of Global Studies. Her research focuses on problems of development, labor, social conflict, and war, using comparative and work historical methods of analysis. By recasting these issues in a broad geographical and long-term historical framework, her work teases out patterns of recurrency, evolution, and true novelty in contemporary processes of globalization. So she will share today with us a presentation. Thank you very much, Beverly. And after her presentation, Gabriel and me and Ana will be sharing some of the questions or comments that there might be, and then we can keep talking with Beverly.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation and the chance to share my work with all of you. I'm hopefully going to now share the PowerPoint. Let me know if you see that.
Yes, perfect.
Good, and let me just play from start. Okay, so the title actually that I was given was Forces of Labor, Development, and Globalization from a World Systems Perspective. And what I'm going to do today is share the results from a major collaborative research working group project that I've been involved in some ways since the 1980s, but this current iteration has been going on for about 10 years, and we're about ready to publish the main findings. And so what I'm going to share is some of the results of this ongoing research on which is essentially on global social protest from a world, including labor unrest, from a world systems perspective. So first I wanted to start, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a book I published in 2003 entitled Forces of Labor. It was actually translated into Spanish by Akal. In any case, this book drew on a collaborative research project from back in the 1980s and early 90s, where we were collecting reports of labor unrest from around the world, from the international reporting of the New York Times and the London Times. And this is just one of the figures. On the y-axis, there's the number of reports of labor unrest, the number of articles about labor unrest in these two newspaper sources. And on the x-axis, that covers the years from 1870 to 1996, when we ended that phase, this early project on world labor unrest. And I'm going to talk about a few of the things that came out of that earlier project, because they then become the basis of some of the questions underlying the more recent project. So one thing I just I'll come back to some of these other patterning going on here in this time series. But I first just wanted to point to the fact that there's a sharp decline in reports of labor unrest globally, starting around 1978, and then another sharp drop, a little bit of a plateau, and then another sharp drop after 89, and then a continuing drop in the mid-1990s. So, this is the period of sorry, I've got one problem, but I think I'm just going to have to live with my problem, because I can't see it, the format of the PowerPoint is a bit of a problem for me, but I'll survive. So, if we think about it, this does correspond to the period. 78 is the election of Thatcher. 80 is the election of Ronald Reagan. Both of them openly confront labor movements, right? Thatcher coming down coercively on the miners, on the UK miners, Reagan on the air traffic controllers. In other words, this late 70s, early 80s is a transition period in terms of labor capital relations in the core countries, because whereas up until 78, it would be almost unheard of for a direct coercive approach being taken to strikes in labor, particularly major, powerful unions like mine workers and air traffic controllers, that this was a turning point where the coercive measures started to be used more and more against labor. And we're also, of course, in the period of Latin American dictators, in the dictatorships in this period, and coercion in the front in Latin America. 89 is, of course, the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And by 1994, we're in this period that came to be understood under the acronym TINA, meaning there is no alternative. It was Thatcher's phrase that there was no alternative to neoliberalism, and it became widely accepted even by left-leaning governments and movements that there was no alternative and that they needed to somehow adjust to this new and hostile environment. This was also the period around here where in the mid-90s, when social science theories about the end of history became prominent. Including Fukuyama is the most obvious of those. And so, and it was the period when the United States was the sole superpower. And so this period here was posited not just by Fukuyama types as the end of history, but more broadly in the social sciences and among journalists as the end of any significant role for labor or labor movements as social actors in the world. Our argument, we ended that project, the data collection for that project in 1996. And, some of my graduate students PhD students were saying, no, we should keep the data collection going. But it was very difficult because there were so few reports that you were looking for like a needle in a haystack, which is, very methodologically difficult. It has methodological problems as well as, it's not that much fun as research to be running around looking for a needle in the haystack. So, but at the same time, we felt we were clear that while the 1990s, there had been a clear, unmistakable collapse of labor movements that globally, that this nadir was not. It was nadir, but it was not the end of history. And there were, two reasons why we felt that even back in the 90s, right, we felt that it was not the end of history. And this had to do, and it was, raised in the introduction for me, it had to do with looking at past history and seeing that there had been other periods of decline and collapse of existing class movements, labor movements, various different kinds of social struggles, but that they had tended to be, these collapses tended to be temporary, and at least for two reasons. And these are the two reasons I'm going to focus on today. One has to do with looking at the longue durée geopolitical history, and the other has to do with looking at the longue durée world economic history. And so if we look at, if we take the present, right, as a period of crisis of world hegemony, of crisis and breakdown of US world hegemony, and we look back to the past, we can see that in prior periods of world hegemonic transition, that is, in the transition from Dutch to British hegemony in the late 18th and early 19th century, and in the transition from British to US world hegemony in the first half of the 20th century, that these periods of hegemonic crisis and breakdown were characterized also by major global waves of social unrest. So we can think in the first transition, that everything from the Haitian Revolution, French Revolution, to the waves of national liberation, of independence in the Americas, in the transition from in the early 20th century. Of course, we have among other things, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, major waves of labor unrest throughout the core, and national liberation and decolonization movements. So I'll, in a minute, come back to, I'm just now saying that periods of world hegemonic crisis and breakdown are periods of major waves of global social conflict historically. And I'll come back a little bit to talk about why that might be. But for right now, I just wanted to make the point that if we look historically at the ebbs and flows of mass social conflict, social unrest from below in world history, that there seems to be a correlation between these periods of world hegemonic crisis and breakdown and major waves of global social conflict. So that's the first point. And the second is looking at it more from the, not from the world political side, but from the world economic side, and the idea that capitalism is characterized by processes of creative destruction. All that is solid melts into air, right? This kind of continuous transformations that lead to the unmaking of existing working classes, but the making of new working classes. So we get, and again, I'll go into more detail about this, but a lot of not only the end of history kind of theories, but the theories about the end of class conflict and class actors and labor as a serious actor on the locally and globally, in processes of social change, that this comes from an excessive focus on the unmaking side. So focusing, for example, on those working classes that were unmade due to processes of deindustrialization in the core countries in the early years of neoliberalism, but not focusing on new working classes that were being created in countries to which capital went, right? So with, and in a sense, one, it'll come up again later, but one way we've tended to refer to this as a shorthand is that where capital goes, conflict follows, labor capital conflict follows. So capital will often go places in search of cheap labor, but will, in the process of expanding production in those areas, also create new working classes, empower new working classes that lead to waves of labor unrest. So to some extent, I'm going to talk, well, not to some extent, I'm going to talk more about the geopolitical first because it's more specific to the current historical period that we're in, to the current historical moment. But I will also come to the world economic because they are intertwined. They're interconnected processes. And so in order to get the full picture, we need to see from both angles, but it's almost impossible to talk about both angles simultaneously because of the complexities. So as a methodological way of being able to look at these, large scale, long-term processes, we can make choices to do that successively from different angles of vision. And so I'm going to focus first on this geopolitical angle. This is just another way of saying what I've already said, that, one of our main hypotheses in this new research project was the periods of crisis and breakdown of world hegemonies are associated with major waves of labor and social conflict on a world scale. So I think I'm going to skip this for the moment. This is, I'll just briefly talk about it because I wanted to get to the empirical results of our new research as it relates to this hypothesis. But sometimes when I jump to talking about the empirical, there's no theoretical underpinning to what I'm saying, but then if I talk too much about theory without the empirical, it's too abstract. So I'm trying to, to kind of find the right balance here. So, but let me just put this up. This is this is from Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System. I published, with Giovanni Arrighi and others in 1999. And in that book, we were, and this also published by a call in Spanish, if anyone wants in Spanish. But in 1999, we what we were doing was comparing, trying to compare the transitions from Dutch to British hegemony and from British to US hegemony as a way of understanding this questions of recurrence and evolution and the specificities of the current historical moment we were in. So in other words, this book we were writing while still the US was the sole unchallengeable superpower, but based on the study of the past hegemonic transitions, we suspected that, and we argued that, in fact, this height of US world power was, this unchallengeable height of US world power was temporary and was going to lead to a deep crisis. And here I've just circled, this is just a summary of the comparison of the two past hegemonic transitions, right? So it's a model in the sense that it summarizes key elements of what happened in past hegemonic transitions. And what's interesting to me now, it's 23 years later, and the three things that we single out as kind of core features of world hegemonic crises seem to describe the current moment that we're in extremely well, right? So growing interstate rivalries and inter-enterprise competition, emergence of new configurations of power, right? So very major changes in the global balance of power, and rising social conflicts. And so this is a way to say, and these again are interconnected. And one of the things we were trying to argue in '99 was that all the two previous past hegemonic crises went from hegemonic crises to hegemonic breakdown in a long period of systemic chaos. But we argued there was nothing inevitable about that, and we were. And that one of the purposes of writing that book was try to identify the alternative paths to avoid the collapse or into systemic chaos. And I think one thing that's been pretty depressing in recent years is this sense that, in fact, all the things that we were thinking were necessary to do to avoid the systemic chaos, actually the opposite was done. And I'll get to some of that in a minute, and we're now, likely moved over a column already into the systemic chaos. And so whereas our question in 1999 was how to avoid falling into systemic chaos and all the suffering that entailed, by now the question is how to shorten, if at all possible, the period of systemic chaos and reduce the attendant suffering and find a solution, a way out of the crisis. So now I'm going back. Let me go back a little bit. I'll kind of toggle back and forth between the empirical and some of these conceptual issues. This is back to the original World Labor Group data collection that I showed you on the very first slide. And as this, again, I still have the arrow here for the decline starting in 1978 to 1996, pointing to a kind of period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where, they're not the peaks, which are back here, and there's a kind of, minor linear decline, but that it's fairly high, stable, but not with this kind of explosive rising and explosive pattern. So what we're getting is again, from this old data collection project on world labor unrest, reports of world labor unrest, that we're getting this rising trend of social conflict from the early 20th century up until after the Second World War. Then a stabilization, it's no longer like that, right? And then a collapse. So what does this mean? Sorry, keep going the wrong way here. So there's a blank there for, okay. This was another one. I think I may come back and talk about this later, but it's another way of thinking about how to divide the historical periods. And, one of the things, I'm not sure I'll have time to really talk about it in the context of this lecture, but another way to think about it is that there's a strong interconnection between this cycles of world hegemony, the systemic cycles of accumulation. And for those of you who are familiar with Arrighi's theory of systemic cycles of accumulation, they begin and they end with a major wave of financialization. So this is another way of looking at this data as a systemic cycle of accumulation with the UK-led financial expansion at the beginning and the US-led financial expansion at the end. And they both led to different levels, but levels of temporary declines in labor unrest. But then the early decline in the late 19th century was clearly just short-lived. Okay, so as I mentioned, in the 1990s, we stopped doing the data collection, not because we thought it was the end of history, but just because it seemed better to wait until things started to take off again. And we were sure they were going to take off. It just was not sure exactly when, right? And so I remember I was on an airplane in May 2010, going from Seoul to Beijing, and they were handing out free copies of the Financial Times. And I'm looking on the front page, and there's reports of major strikes wave in the automobile industry in China. There's massive anti-austerity protests in Europe. There's a general strike in South Africa. There's protests in Tunisia, which were what would end up being the beginning of the Arab Spring. And there's probably other things I'm forgetting about. Latin America and the US were somehow a little out of it for different reasons at this point. But so I said, I looked at this and I said, okay, now's the time to restart the data collection project. And by the time, this project is now 20 years later, from the first end of the first project, well, 20 years is an exaggeration, but anyway, less than 20 years, but when we started back up again. But in the meantime, the newspapers had been digitized, not just the contemporary newspapers, but the historical newspapers have been digitized. And so we did a similar but different data collection and this time on all forms of global social protest. So actually this was, I think, meant to be the slide I meant to show when I was talking about. So May 2010 was when I was on the airplane. By 2011, Time magazine was naming the protester as the person of the year. And it says from the Arab Spring to Athens, from Occupy Wall Street to Moscow, so this idea of a global wave of social protest. And this, with ups and downs, the second decade of the 21st century has been a decade of massive global social protest. And by 2019, so the year before the pandemic, there were tons of reporting and articles and thought pieces about how protest was taking off in this headline, protest in every corner of the globe. So this idea that we had entered another rare but not without precedent period of mass global social protest within the last decade seemed to have some validity. Okay. So we set out to do the new data collection, which we're calling the Global Social Protest Data Set. And this time, we decided to include all forms of social protest, including labor unrest, but not to just limit to labor unrest. This was for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was in the old project, we came to understand that labor movement, you couldn't really, labor movements were often intertwined with other movements, whether they be, national liberation movements or feminist movements, or both positively, and so therefore, we wanted to be able to also understand the interrelations, even when we're just focused on labor. But we also, the question of this broader question of all forms of social protest was of interest. So it opened up all sorts of conceptual problems, which is another story maybe for another day. But nevertheless, this is the data set we now have. So we determined to use the digitized historical archives of the New York Times for all international reports of social protest except the United States. And we used The Guardian and Observer for all international reports of social protest except the UK. And we settled, after a bunch of tests, we settled on a search string where we used kind of protest action terms. And we pulled out, in using the search string, we pulled out 500,000 articles, and we began randomly coding them. And at this point, for this earlier period, for the period up to 2016, we've got 2,700 and anyway, we got 2,000. Anyway, you can read it. 379,000 articles from the New York Times, 157 articles from the Guardian, some of which were false positives, but we went through and coded them. And this is what the equivalent results. So next, I think, if I know what the next slide is, I'm going to be showing the time series of global social protest that comes out of this project from 1851 to 2016, and just like to think back, in the earlier project, we ended in that deep trough in the 1990s, but with the prediction that this was not the end of history. And so when we did our time series with this new data set, this is what we got. Is the photos in the way there? If I move them, does it have to be moved? I'm not sure. So this is mentions of social protest on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. Here again, we see this trough in the 1990s, and then we see after the 2008 crisis, particularly after my airplane ride in 2010, this big wave, it's not the world historical peak, but it's pretty high and pretty close, right? And we're now, goes up to 2016, we're now updating to 2020, and it remains high, through to the present. But I don't have I can't show you the updated till now, but nevertheless, this fits in. This is consistent with our first hypothesis, right? But but there are different ways of thinking about this last decade, right? So we have this last decade very kind of, as evident not only from our time series, but from things like, the general discussion and general common sense. Like if I ask my students, are we living in a period of major social protest? They'll say yes. And again, it doesn't mean that even in the 90s, or in these other trough periods, it's not that in a subset of countries there wasn't major social protest. But what distinguishes these periods, these peaks in the series, is these tend to be things are happening all over. And I've got a different time series I can show with the number of countries experiencing waves of unrest. But in any case, the point is that these are, it's not only the number of reports of social unrest, but how widespread they are in terms of the number of countries and places involved. But nevertheless, there's an alternative. One way to think about it is, somehow related to this geopolitical crisis of hegemony, right? And hegemonic breakdown. But another way is to say that this waves in the second decade of the 21st century, were just a flash in the pan. So I don't know. I'm finding that like the term flash in the pan, it's even in most people, when I'm speaking to native English speakers, they actually don't know the phrase, but I actually don't know whether it's a phrase in Spanish or not. But what it means is that when you're cooking with oil and you heat the oil too much, the oil can catch on fire. So you get this big fire, but it's inside the pan. And if you put the lid on the pan, right, the fire goes out. So one possibility is that this upsurge in global social protest, recent upsurge, is a flash in the pan, that by putting the lid on, and here in this case, putting the lid is a combination of repression and maybe some concessions, some mixture of reforms and repression, can put the lid on and things will be back on kilter, right? But if it's part of this ongoing crisis of world hegemony, and hopefully I'll remember to come back and explain how a crisis of world hegemony relates to rising social conflict. It relates. Let me just say, when I say hegemony, I'm using hegemony in the Gramscian sense of the word, in the sense that that hegemonies involve leadership where those in power claim to, and at least partly credibly, offer benefits or serve in the interest not only of their own narrow interests, they do serve in their narrow interests, but they also serve in a broader interest. And what starts to happen with crisis of hegemony is that these powers either no longer want to, or no longer can, or no longer do. So you have a fraying of the social fabric, a fraying of social compacts, the collapse of existing social compacts, and rising social conflict. So, okay, so we have opened the question, whether it's a flash in the pan, in which case, as we update the data and as we live the coming history, we won't see an escalation here, but we'll see it brought under control. Or, where the red line goes suggests that maybe the analogy is to the early first half of the 20th century. And what we have, the 2011 is maybe the equivalent of 1905 or 1898, and we're on a upward trajectory like this. So this is actually, I stuck in this chart again. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's from Piketty and Science, where this is the United States, and it's the top 10% of the top 10% income share going to what percentage of total income goes to the top percent of earners, basically. And what it's showing is, this U curve, which I think it's happening. This is the United States, but it's, again, with variation, it's happening almost everywhere over over the 20th century and into the early 21st century, that in the earlier period of crisis of British hegemony, there's a massive growth in inequality, which is, again, part of the underlying process to the fraying of the social compacts and the rising social unrest. And likewise, in the late 20th, early 21st century, there's a massive increase in social inequality. And so we're getting an increasing, in a sense, crisis of social legitimacy for capitalism. So these periods of escalating social conflict on a world scale, another way to look at them, are periods in which social compacts are being frayed, among other reasons, due to this massive growth in inequality, other ways, and that these in turn is creating a vicious circle between social conflict and hegemonic crisis. There's another element which I've written about elsewhere, which is also very important, which is the kind of interrelationship between wars and social conflict and revolution. And I can come back to that later if it's necessary to fill in the gaps. I can come back to it in the Q&A. Here again, just back to this thing. This is the same thing, but focusing a bit more on, I think I'm just going to skip over this. It's again, more of a specification of the same argument, but with a clearer focus on the question of the intensification of social conflicts. So this is from the chapter specifically focused on the dynamics of social cohesion and social conflict in world hegemonic transitions. And you'll see here that the escalation of interstate and interstate power struggles, it plays the intensification of social conflict plays a role in fostering growing interstate conflict, and the interstate conflict, war, and other things, hot and various, levels of war, also lead to an escalation of social conflict. Like, no coincidence that the two peaks in our earlier series on labor unrest were the periods right after World War I and World War II. Okay. So, and this was actually the point I was just making, that in the earlier one, the peaks were in just after World War I and after World War II. This is the old data, right? Oh, sorry. No, I'm sorry. This is, I don't know why I did that. This is the date. Never mind. Okay. So I meant to have the slide for the old data there. Doesn't matter. So the old data, you saw that I pointed out that the slide that was the new data, but just labor unrest pulled out. This is the new data of all forms of social conflict. So the difference, the new things from the project. Well, for one, there's this update, which shows this current, most recent explosion of global social protest, right? Lots of things are similar, like this 90s trough, this kind of, it's neither, high nor low, it's about, and this upward trend. But the strange thing was this peak in the new data in 1936. So when I first saw it, I was saying, oh dear, there's something wrong with our data, because 36, what in the old data collection on labor unrest, in the original project, it was high, but it was nowhere near like the peaks after the First and Second World War. And so at that point, I was quite worried about what the data, the reliability of the data. And so we went in and we looked and we tried to understand what was producing it, because, I was aware, 36 is a big year for, Mexico, it's a big year for the United States, it's a big year in labor unrest for Paris, Popular Front, France, but to be the overall peak in the historical series just didn't make any sense to me. So we dug in, and I became less worried about the data and more worried about the world, because what it turned out to be was growing fascist and anti-fascist clashes, particularly in the period leading up to the Spanish Civil War. And so, and one thing, with the new, even with the old data set, it's not, we didn't put a litmus test, ideological litmus test on the labor unrest to include it in the data. So you could have a anti-immigrant strike by labor and we would still count it. And here, but in this data set, we include both. If it's social protest, even if it's far right social protest, it's in our data set. So when we pulled out we using terms like far right, fascist, anti-fascist, this from the new data set, this is what it looked like. And I don't know if the pictures are in the way or not. Let me try to, hopefully people can see. And hopefully people can also see why I said I was less worried about the data and more worried about the world, because when you just look at the reports where there's some mention of fascist or anti-fascist mobilization or movements, there's this peak in the 1930s, and this is 36, right? And then there's a peak in the recent years, right? And I think this is, will continue again as we update the data beyond 2016. I can't see this going down. Let me see how I'm doing. Okay. All right. So I'm going to leave this here for a minute, and I'm going to come back in the end and talk about it a bit, because it's like a little much to take in. But this is my effort to sum up the four crises of the long 20th century, and to see them as essentially a pendulum swing between crises where the main problem is social legitimacy, or in Polanyian terms, where the protection of fictitious commodities is too low, and crises of profitability, or where in Polanyi language, it would be protection of fictitious commodities is too high in order to maintain profitability at an acceptable level to capital. All right. And what we're talking about, when I started out and I was talking about 78 Thatcher, 80 Reagan, triumph of neoliberalism, there is no alternative, that, the abandonment of the development project, in the third world, that all of these were responses to the crisis of the, late, say, 68, 73, 80, that crisis of the 1970s, in which was essentially, from the point of view here, a crisis of profitability. And this crisis of profitability was resolved in the Reagan, Thatcher, and post, and neoliberal era by a redistribution of wealth toward capital via the financial expansion. And then by around 2008, and certainly by 2011, and 19, that the inequalities created by the redistribution, by the resolution of the crisis of profitability, was going so far as to produce a deep crisis of social legitimacy for capitalism, right? And I've got this, I set out the long 20th century as essentially a pendulum swing back and forth between crises of profitability and crises of legitimacy. And I make 2 points about that. Underlying this pendulum swing is the idea, is a conceptualization of historical capitalism as being characterized by a fundamental contradiction between profitability and legitimacy. That if profitability gets pushed too far, that it raises issues of social legitimacy. And if social protections go too far, then capital rebels, right? And tries to produce a counter-revolution and a redistribution in wealth back toward capital. So that's, the underlying pendulum swing. And then from that point of view, where we are now is waiting for resolution 4, right? So the very first time I did this chart, it was in 2009. And I was thinking, well, surely with the financial crisis of 2008, those in power will begin to think that they, need that there's this big backlash against globalization happening, and they'll need to reorient, right? And to some extent, actually, I don't know, I have to build the pink tide into this. This is seen from the hegemon, from the dominant power, and then one interesting thing, is that Latin America is definitely part of this picture, right? But is in a slightly different timing, right? So in some sense, the pink tide is a form of effort at resolution 2, right? But that runs into all sorts of problems because it's a hostile world out there. It's a TINA world. So you're trying to do a resolution 2 in a TINA world. But so when I first did this chart, I had put a dashed line in 2008 heading back in this direction, because I said, well, there's certainly, that those with the kind of power economic and political power to bring about some redistribution of wealth, or to at least slow the rising social unrest and attacks on livelihoods and dislocations, that they would, in their own self-interest, they would do that, right? And instead, for the most part, with exceptions, the inequality and dislocations just increased after the 2008 crisis. So I took away the dashed line and just left it blank, because it remains a question to me, is why. I think one of the questions that remains in my mind is why there certainly before, why things didn't move in the second decade of the 21st century, why they didn't move towards some form of resolution for. And I'll come back to, I think I'll come back to that at the very end, because I think certainly it's an important question in terms of thinking about how we get out of the current crisis, or at least keep from sliding further into systemic chaos. And the title of the piece that I wrote, that this figure comes out of, you see on the right there, it's plunges into utter destruction and the limits of historical capitalism, which is a play off of a phrase by Polanyi, because Polanyi says, unless the alternative to a given social setup is a plunge into utter destruction, no crudely selfish class can maintain itself in the lead. So he's saying, okay, let me just, I guess maybe I can summarize it this way. The fact that we did not move swiftly and clearly into a resolution for and a redistribution back toward labor and protections on labor is an indication that we do have very crudely selfish classes in the lead, okay. So this is, I don't want to, I think, I think I've been talking for close to an hour now, so I don't want to go on for too much longer, but I do want to just give you a quick preview of the world economic restructuring hypothesis, and, which I referred to in the beginning, and that is, with the world economic restructuring, including the neoliberal restructuring of the late 20th and early 20th century, which is generally associated with the unmaking and weakening of established labor movements.
Recording stopped.
That world economic this world economic restructuring is where capital goes, labor capital conflict follows. Anyway, so I'm just going to do some quick things here. This is my attempt in a few pictures to illustrate this with the history of the automobile industry, from the mass strike waves in Detroit in the 30s to the Italian hot autumn in 1969, to the defeat of Fiat the Brazilian strike wave of 78, 79. I've got some problems with the Cordo Basso in the story because it fits earlier, but anyway. And then this is the Chinese workers' strike in Honda in China in 2010. So here, this is again just re-emphasizing here. This is an update of looking at the main sites of labor unrest in the automobile industry, going from core in there's Argentina, actually. Well, there's the Cordo Basso, anyway. But what this new data set allows us to see is the waves of labor unrest in the automobile industry. They're disappearing. They tend to be disappearing in the core, right? But becoming more important. And this last two, it's, India and China in the 2010s. There's a wave of labor unrest in the automobile industries in India and China in the second decade of the 21st century, and in India in both. Okay. But, as we look at this new data set, one thing that we're finding is this growth in alternative forms of labor unrest. So this is the blue is the percentage of reports in our data set that are data set labor unrest events in our data set that are strikes. And the red is alternative forms, so non-strike forms of protest. And so that, says, so on the one hand, I think what I was trying to show with this and this, is that it's a mistake to completely write off the role of industrial workers in the social protest and labor unrest in the current period. But at the same time, there is something else going on in the sense that a lot of the labor unrest is taking place outside of the point of production. And this has to do, with and taking place more, we could summarize it as in the streets, protests in the streets versus protests at the point of production. And this is like important aspects for thinking about the power. And I guess, one of the things that I should emphasize is that the power, the question, of why this is linked back to the question of why we haven't seen a resolution for, because some people would argue is that, movements are just too weak, right? And so this is an effort to get at the strength, weakness, the structural bargaining power of labor in the current period, and whether the structural weakness is in some way part of the explanation for why we haven't moved more clearly back to a resolution for more non-strike forms. This is consistent with the idea of where capital goes, conflict goes. The percentage of worldwide labor unrest is the percentage that corresponds to events in the global South has been increasing, right? Unemployment related, again, probably not a coincidence that this unemployment related protest looks a little bit like the fascist, anti-fascist time series, that shape. Okay, and then, all right. So now I'm back here, and I think this is where I'm going to end back at this point. And I had, I can't quite see, there's something I'm missing that I can't see, but let me just try to summarize where I was going to end here. And maybe it's, this I've already said, that the capitalism is a world historical system beset by fundamental contradiction between the pursuit of profitability and the maintenance of social legitimacy, right? And this, sorry for all the text, which is, I know, not the ideal thing to do with PowerPoint presentations, but the actually, the thing here is, again, in terms of trying to understand the current period we're in, there are different possibilities one possibility that this quote is suggesting is that things haven't gotten bad enough yet. So in this context, speaking about the period immediately after the Second World War, the United States, as a world hegemonic state, used its powers to implement policies that helped swing the pendulum back toward the self-protectionist society at the local and global levels. But it took a depression, the rise and spread of fascism, and 2 world wars for it to become clear that if capitalism were to survive, a change of course was essential. So one possibility embedded in this quote is that things have to get much worse, right, for it to get better, which is an extremely worrisome hypothesis to be putting forward for obvious reasons. A second is that there's something particularly venal about the current ruling class. And as I was writing this piece, there were lots of pieces about billionaires building themselves bunkers to survive the apocalypse and, you know, working on getting to Mars and colonizing other planets. And so, you know, there may be some delusional, the levels of wealth and wealth inequality are so high, and particularly levels of wealth, that there may be a delusion going on that somehow, if you have enough money and the right plan, that you can protect yourself from the deepening systemic chaos. And of course, to some extent, it's true because wealthy people definitely have a greater chance of surviving chaos than poor people, but on at a certain level, but it's not. So, and the third is, is one that I think it's also important to end on, and that is that if we look back at Resolution 2, it was meaning the welfare state, the mass production, mass consumption social compact, and the developmental social compact with the third world, that it was very partial, it was very temporary. Within a lot of the world's population was excluded from those social compacts, and that within 2 to 3 decades, it had provoked a deep crisis of profitability for capitalism in the 1970s, as well as demands for an extension or a speeding up of the hegemonic promises of catching up with the wealth standards of the West and mass production. So that this gets back to the fundamental contradiction of historical capitalism that I was referring to, this contradiction between crises of hegemony and, contradiction between crises of profitability and crises of legitimacy, and that there's a open and serious question about whether a resolution number 4, to get back, up here, whether that resolution number 4 can be accomplished within the context of a capitalist system. So I think I'm going to end there. And I look forward to hearing your questions, and I hope it was that you were able to follow everything I was throwing at you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Beverly. We have a problem with, really Anna is having a problem with her computer, so she's not around here anymore. Okay. So we will wait for her, and meanwhile we can do some of the questions. Gabi?
Well, yes. Well, Thank you, Beverly. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. Well, I think that world system theory, and in particular, Ari and Silver's perspective, is a fundamental tool in the social sciences. And especially, I think the Beverly perspective made a big contribution by introducing the working class to the theory. It's very important to study the hegemonic transitions on working class, or the hegemony process. Well, my questions. One, in one of your recent articles, you give a lot of importance to the role of education workers, both in relation to the resistance to current capitalism, and also to think about next world order, a new hegemony, or perhaps a new system. Well, if you can you develop this idea? Second question is that a wave of protests broke out in South America earlier, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. How are these regional differences explained? Or what do you think about that? You know, the water war in Bolivia in 2000s, the crisis of Argentina, and the social movements, unrest, or labor unrest, well, or the crisis in Brazil. Third question is, how do you analyze the role of China in the situation of systemic chaos, and in relation to the four resolutions? Is China an important player in the transition? But what do you think about China and the four resolution?
Yeah.
And my final question is, there is a certain diagnosis in the liberal elites, the Biden government, or the Financial Times, for example, in the media, about the crisis of neoliberalism, and what they recommended a change in policy, like redistribution of the incomes, or labor policies, supported the unions. Well, do you see any perspective to that? It's a realistic policy, or is a simple, idea, or to support some electoral situations? Well, I have these 4 questions. I have more questions, but I think it's enough.
That's more than
Sorry
enough, I think.
for my English.
No. Sorry, Beverly, can you please end up your presentation so that we can see better and people can see your face?
Right.
That's it. Thank you. Okay, and I think I will add a short question to the ones that Gabriel did. You said that one possibility is things going worse. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you mean by seeing that things can go worse in terms of this crisis of legitimacy, in terms of the pursuit of profitability? What do you mean by that? That's it.
Okay. Maybe I'll thank you for those questions. They're all really excellent questions. Maybe I'll just start with the last one, by just to clarify what I mean by things going worse. So by that, I mean like deepening systemic chaos to the point where even those who think they can protect themselves from the chaos due to their privileged position come to see that they cannot, and that therefore need for their own self-protection to at least not stand in the way of certain kinds of transformations or protections of others, that a more broadening social protection. So, in the previous transitions, even though there were often obvious solutions for shortening the period of systemic chaos, they often weren't taken up until things got very bad, including for the wealthy and powerful. So that's, one possible interpretation of what's happening, like in terms of this comparison between previous transitions and past transitions. It's like, well, it's not exactly like we moved quickly and easily, right, to the post-war resolution with all its limits, because I need to be clear that a key part of understanding this whole story is that post-war resolution had major limits. It excluded the majority of the world's population. It excluded based on, citizenship based on within countries based on race, on gender, and it so it and it made promises that it couldn't even fully keep to the small percentage of the world's, let's say, working classes that were incorporated into this mass production, mass consumption kind of American dream type social compact. And even then, it lasted for a couple of decades and then led to a crisis of profitability. So on the one hand, the move to the solution, the resolution, right, post-war resolution, happened after things got very bad, 2 world wars, depression, fascism, genocides, right? The complete breakdown of the world economy, et cetera, of course, the rise of communist revolutions, from the point of view of the U.S. and capitalist elites was, clearly things getting bad. So, and in fact, the competition, with the Soviet Union, was kind of fundamental to, again, producing the post-World War II resolution. So what would it mean? It's the problem is, what would it mean for things to get much worse? Unfortunately, we can imagine a lot of things getting much worse. We can certainly, this rise of far-right fascist movements, in multiple parts of the world, locally, Brazil, we have to, some thanks to Brazilians, right now, but there's not a lot of thanks to go around, in other places. So we, of course, we have this war going on that's not at all clear, whether it's going to just spin out of control. One of the interesting things is that, is this tie between historically between the internal social conflict problems and problems of internal legitimacy and this desire or taking a chance of rulers to try to go for popular little wars, that then, sometimes blow up in their face, and unfortunately the face of majority of the population. So, but the destructive, obviously, the level of destructive military power, particularly in the hands of the United States, is such that this is like you can't hope things get worse, because it may be the end. And then finally, there's the climate change context, which was not on the blimp. So what's interesting is in that chart, Polanyi has three, right? Land, labor, money. Yeah, he has three fictitious commodities: land, labor, and money, right? And so my chart is, you could think about it as labor and money, the capital, money, and labor, workers. And I left out land because in some sense it wasn't this problem of the disasters to be created by treating land and the environment as fictitious commodities was just out of the discussion, right, in the 20th century. It was free good to be exploited, and so, but now, I think if I were to do a different form, just focusing on the parameters of Resolution 4, I would think that it would be necessary to also bring in this problem of land or the environment or ecology as a fictitious commodity, energy, as essential to thinking about the resolution. So, I think that the worrying thing is, anyway, let me not say I've upset. I think it's obvious what the worrying thing is. Let me, I think one thing I should say also in this context is that one way I've been viewing the history, right, is that these waves of social unrest, mass popular mobilizations, that they have in some cases, and particularly in some periods, they're oriented toward state power or various forms of power. But they also, I see them as having a big impact on letting those with wealth and political power know the grievances from below and what needs to be done in order to stabilize, in order to create a hegemonic solution that's not solely based on coercion, but also has an element of consent. So there's this problem of finding the hegemonic solution or the resolution, which is some combination of that has to have a serious element of consent. But, if it's just becoming, there's a piece that I wrote, the title is Crises of World Hegemony and the Speeding Up of Social History. So it's this idea that the crises are coming faster and faster. And that's because, the limits of capital are capital itself, right? We're at a point where the solutions to capitalism are getting harder and harder to find within the context of capitalism. And so, and we, and we were already seeing that with how short it was from the end of World War II to the crisis of the 70s, to that signal crisis, right? So I think this is letting me go backwards, because then it links to Gabrielle's question about the diagnosis of the liberal elites and, the attempt to redistribute, that there's a bit of this move toward back toward, protectionism, domestic production, industrial policy, a bit of support for wages rising, that the heart of neoliberalism is in some elements, abandoning it certainly for itself. It's been banning it for itself for a while, but also for others. But that, immediately there's this massive inflation, right? So there's a you see a minor step, right, in one direction, and you see capital going on strike, right? So capital is, anyway. The question on how to analyze the role of China, China, it's fundamental, and in general, one of there are different possible trajectories for the resolution of the crisis, if there is to be a resolution. But one thing, and on the which I didn't have space to talk about, is clearly, there's a changing balance of power globally, and the question becomes whether and to what extent China is consciously or unconsciously, or proactively, or through example, offering some kind of alternative hegemonic model. And so when I started looking at the labor unrest in China around the period of 2010, and there was at that point, when I think going on till today, if we look at that inequality, right? China, of course, went through a period of growing inequality, right? But then the pendulum started to shift back earlier in China, and that the internal inequality has been decreasing in China, right? Then the second contested issue. One issue has to do with what is happening internally within China, and to the extent, so there's this globalization of the New Deal. After World War II, the idea of globalization of the New Deal in China, does China represent a move toward lessening inequality in a context of a country that doesn't have top levels of GNP per capita, right? So, the US, Western Europe is a model with extremely high levels of GNP per capita, was always a problematic question. I think maybe you might want to come back and ask me more more specifically. There's, again, the question of how to interpret Belt and Road Initiative, and again, to the extent that it is can be posed as a hegemonic project, meaning a hegemonic project in the Gramscian sense that it's, of course, in the interests of people within China, classes, groups within China, but it's also in the interest of those outside China. That it's an empirical question. It's not an ideological question. It's a question of what is actually what's happening in terms of how this additional it has different aspects. One is, of course, the alternatives to the United States, the existence of an alternative to the United States for, among others, Latin American countries, and the other is, actual material benefits, and it, becomes a question. Okay. Let me answer the question on, it doesn't really follow, but let me answer the question on education workers. In some sense, I can link it back to the question of which workers are in a position to formulate alternative solutions, right? So if you look at Marx's writing, and particularly Marx and Engels in the manifesto, they're fairly optimistic about the prospects of labor internationalism, and they're fairly optimistic also about the prospects of labor solidarity across different status groups within countries, So, and this is, obviously in some of the historical writings, they're more complicated, but, and it's because in the high level theorization, they're seeing capital is producing a kind of homogenizing, on the one hand, kind of homogenizing results. On the other hand, they're seeing a situation where, in their discussion of capital accumulation, you have active labor force, right? You have unemployed, kind of reserve armies, so these kind of, you could think about the Marx type, Polanyi type labor unrest if you want, or those completely excluded, so kind of this growing surplus population. And in a highly abstract model, they're all from the same, these different kind of strata workers who are more or less secure, right? All come from the same community, and they're not stratified by race or citizenship, right? But capitalism historically has been embedded with colonialism, slavery, various forms of patriarchy, and so that the actually existing capitalism, racism and patriarchalism, and is deeply embedded in the formation of working class, right? And so the problem becomes to find, to get back to the question of, to get to the a hegemonic solution from below, because even though I haven't explicitly said it, I think where I'm going is that the hegemonic solutions from above are becoming more and more short-lived, more and more unfeasible, right? And the solution from below would have to overcome this tendency to grab on to privileges, status privileges, in order to protect oneself from competition from other workers, right? So this is where I get to the teachers, coming around to the teachers. So the interesting thing about education, what I was calling education workers, is that, well, first, if you look at our data set on world labor unrest, the education sector is one of the places where strikes and labor unrest has been growing in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So teachers are becoming an important central part of labor unrest, and that has to do, it fits in with our idea of where capital goes, or where the working class expands, that you get also an expansion of labor capital conflict or labor unrest. And so the central role of teachers makes sense from the point of view of the global expansion of the education industry, right? But one thing that is like coming up in different places, because you have the problem that there are workers who have strategic bargaining power, but they're isolated and don't have an incentive to use that bargaining power for a broader class interest, right? Sometimes they will, but a lot of times it's where you get the vulnerability to the kind of they become vulnerable to like the privileged worker kind of political isolation. And teachers have some interesting forms of disruptive power to the social division of labor, because if they go on strike, like nothing else can work, because parents can't, are stuck with the children, and and so it is, they do have an interesting form of disruptive power, various forms of disruptive power, but they're also one of the parts of the working class, an increasingly important part of the working class, that's embedded in communities in a way that means that they can offer a vision where they're saying that their struggles are, of course, in their interest, in the sense of better working conditions for them and better wages for them, but they're also in the broader community interest in terms of better schools for children, better services to families, right? And that they're actually quite aware, because of where they're embedded in communities, about what the problems are and what the potential solutions to those problems are. So it's interesting, because a lot of teacher strikes, that I've been following, they're very disruptive to communities, but they often have incredible support from the same communities that are being disrupted because of this capacity to pose, Okay. Anyway, let me leave it there. And I didn't answer the regional differentiation. I have to, I need to, maybe the most important thing, I guess, is just to clarify that there's not an argument of simultaneity everywhere. And in fact, that as we get down, and particularly, looking at the world economic processes, that there's actually almost a built-in non-simultaneity, in the sense of the contradictions in one location being resolved through displacement to another location. So that's a big part of the argument about capital mobility, right? That, capital mobility, the relocation of capital resolves a problem dealing with working class in an area where the working class is strong. And then, it brings the labor unrest under control in the area where working class is strong because there's disinvestment, but there's new investment in a different geographical area or industrial, and then it merges there. So the difference between the periods of hegemony and the periods of hegemonic crisis and breakdown is in the periods of hegemony, there's this little bit of this going on, right? The contradictions there's a relational process where the contradictions in one site are brought under control, but then lead to the emergence of contradictions in another geographical site. And that's why I was a little bit trying to show with my pictures of the automobile industry, right? But in periods of hegemonic crisis and breakdown, in part because the capacity, to easily relocate capital, starts to become problematic, and for other reasons, that's when the simultaneity starts to happen. And that's something of, the last 10 years, right? When we start to see this sort of pretty much, it's easier to say where there hasn't been like a major wave of unrest in the since 2010, and often, almost everywhere in some of the same years, within a year or two of each other. So, so I mean, this is a little bit of an abstract answer, but I can do it. It's a little, I can't do it precisely with your question, but with the automobile industry, it was very clear, that first it was Detroit in the 1930s, and then it was UK in the 1950s, and then Italy in the 60s, Argentina's, messing up my story in the late 60s, but, and then Brazil by the 70s, and, and South Africa, and then late 80s, South Korea, and then, another decade, and it's China, right? So this is that story, right? Where the contradictions in one place, are being resolved by the unmaking of working classes here through disinvestment and the creation of new working classes here. And so they kind of just tend to, and that's why there's that several decades where there's high levels of labor unrest and social unrest, but they're not like all, it's happening like this. It's not, you're not getting these standout peaks. Whereas in the early 20th century, you start to get this clustering worldwide, and it's a fundamentally different problem where the normal mechanisms of resolving the contradictions through this world economic processes and through restructuring of capital accumulation, or they don't work anymore, or they're insufficient, resolving the crisis for capitalism. And I think a big part of what I want to talk about, but I don't talk about, is from all the social unrest being something that is a signal to ruling elites that turns out they don't want to listen to, or they're not capable of listening to and acting upon. In the big, again, there's local. I think there's some local, and maybe, China's so complicated, but anyway, there's different local questions, and whether local questions have global solutions, global implications. But it's still like this idea of the social protest is sending signals that will allow for a solution from above. And the kind of question, that I have is really whether that solution from above is going to come in time or is even possible given who the actors are, and therefore then how to maybe reorient toward how do you build the solution from below using the same knowledge that we have about, what are the kind of key grievances that are coming up from these waves of social protest. You can begin to clear to understand what the problems of people are from these protests. Anyway, so somewhat of a circuitous answer, but I think I kind of hit on everything.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you answered more than we asked.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very generous.
Yeah, I see there's no questions on YouTube, so yeah. All right.
Oh, thank you so much, Beverly. It was an honor to listen to.
Okay.
I mean, this thorough and vast analysis you've made, really.
Yeah.
We'll keep thinking. I mean, like during the night, and probably tomorrow and next week again. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Beverly.
Yes. A pleasure.
Yeah.
Well,
I hope to keep in touch. Yeah.
yes, this is the idea.
Good.
Keep in touch.
Maybe I'll see you at the next session, I hope. Gabriel's
Right.
session, right?
Right. On the 17th. Yeah. So Gabriel is talking next week on Thursday at 6 p.m. local time in Argentina. So everybody is invited, of course, and see you on Thursday.
I'm just getting out of class at that time, so I should be able to, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We look forward to see you then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.